Welcome to Deep Dive. In this episode, we talk about the occult roots of religious studies. We have one source, a paper by Yves Muhlematter and Helmut Zander, Occult Roots of Religious Studies.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're venturing into a really fascinating and maybe unexpected area. The history connecting the early field of religious studies with, well, occult or esoteric traditions.
Right. It sounds a bit strange at first, doesn't it?
It does. You think of religious studies as this, academic thing, but maybe its roots are closer to the beliefs it studies.
Exactly. And if you're listening because you like getting to the core of things, this should offer a pretty fresh perspective on a field you might think you know.
Definitely. We're looking at material from the Occult Roots of Religious Studies, an introduction by Yves Muhlematter and Helmut Zander.
And it really challenges some standard ideas about how disciplines like this develop.
So our mission, let's say, for this deep dive, explore that early connection, how religious studies sort of pulled away later, and why understanding this hidden history actually matters today.
Makes sense. So where do Muhlematter and Zander start?
Well, they kick off with a pretty fundamental idea about esotericism itself.
Right, the idea that it's not some weird fringe thing off to the side.
Exactly. Their first main argument is just that. Esotericism isn't separate or marginal. It's actually, they argue, an inherent part of the dominant cultures it exists within.
Which is a big claim to start with. It reframes it immediately.
It does. And if you accept that premise, it makes you think differently about how religious studies got started, doesn't it?
It suggests the foundations might be less purely, rational or purely academic, and more embedded in the cultural currents of the time.
Yeah.
Including esoteric ones.
Precisely. Which leads right into their second big thesis, and this is the one that I think will surprise a lot of people.
Okay, what is it?
That religious studies has significant but often ignored origins in the field of esotericism, or occultism, as it was often called back then, late 19th century.
Wow.
Okay.
Because the usual story is quite different.
Totally different. The standard narrative emphasizes, adopting scientific methods, philology, ethnology, sociology.
And crucially, separating itself from theology, making it secular scientific.
Right. That's the story we usually get. But these standard histories, they barely mention, if at all, any connections to esoteric movements.
It's like a deliberate omission almost, or at least a major blind spot.
It feels like it. And here's a kicker they mention, Friedrich Max Miller.
The Max Miller,
That-
often called a founder of religious studies.
That's the one. Apparently, he had quite an intensive engagement with Blavatsky's theosophy.
No kidding. That's not in the standard biographies, is it?
Not usually, no. And they say similar connections were there in Indology, too. So you have this key figure not operating in some purely rational space.
It suggests the very DNA of the field might have this unexpected element mixed in. It challenges that idea of a clean, objective start.
It really does, and it makes you question how clear-cut these disciplinary boundaries are anyway.
Well, that's another point the authors make, right? That the lines we draw between religious studies, theology, maybe the study of Western esotericism, they're kind of artificial.
Yeah. They argue esotericism itself is inherently interdisciplinary. It pulls from philosophy, religion, science.
So trying to neatly box everything up might miss the point, especially historically.
Okay, so if these roots, these occult connections, were ignored or repressed, what happened? Did it have lasting effects? The book talks about path dependencies.
Yes, and that's where it gets really interesting, how these overlooked origins sort of channeled the development of the field, even up to now.
So how did that work? What are the examples?
Well, they give several. For instance, early Timatologists, apparently many had close personal ties to theosophy.
But it didn't show up in their academic work.
Generally not explicitly, no. It was like a background influence. The book mentions Julian Strube's work on John Woodruff, Arthur Avalon, and Jens Schleider's research on Walter Evans Wentz.
Evans Wentz of the Tibetan Book of the Dead fame?
There's him. So this hidden layer was there, influencing scholars, but not openly acknowledged in the scholarship itself.
Fascinating, and not just Tibet.
No, they also point to research on Jewish Kabbalah, Boaz Huss's work on Martin Buber and Gershom Scholem, showing their engagement with esoteric or perennialist ideas.
Scholem, the giant of Kabbalah studies.
The very same. And others too, like Paul Masson-Arcel. These connections were there.
And it's not purely historical, it still echoes.
Apparently so. They mention more recent figures. And Honfave, a key founder of modern academic study of esotericism, had an early interest in perennial philosophy, that idea of a single truth behind all religions.
Which is a very common esoteric theme.
Exactly. And Cuckoo von Stuckrad, another major scholar today, actually published in esotericism before his main academic career. And then you have someone like Jeffrey Kripal, who is quite open about incorporating esoteric ideas into his work.
So these threads haven't entirely vanished, but the main field did try to distance itself. How did that shape its theories? You mentioned the rejection of experience.
Right. This is crucial for understanding the theoretical shift. As religious studies was finding its feet, it had to define itself against, well, both natural science and theology.
A tricky position.
Very. And a key move was rejecting an epistemology, a way of knowing based on personal experience. The German word was Erleben, strongly associated with Rudolf Otto.
Otto and the idea of the numinous, the holy.
Yes, but that reliance on subjective experience sounded too much like what esotericists were claiming: direct personal paths to truth.
Ah, I see. So to be seen as more objective, more scientific, religious studies downplayed or rejected that subjective experiential dimension.
That seems to be the argument. It was part of drawing that boundary against esotericism.
Okay, what about comparative religion? That seems like an area where both academics and, say, theosophists might have overlapped, comparing different traditions.
They definitely both did it, but maybe with different goals. The comparative method has roots in both occult and non-occult circles.
How did the goals differ?
Well, the occult or perennialist view often aimed to find the common core, the single universal truth hidden in all religions.
The perennial philosophy again.
Exactly. Whereas academic religious studies over time tended to focus more on the historical contexts and the differences between religions rather than assuming a shared essence.
But the method of comparison might have been similar initially.
Apparently so. Similar techniques, different aims, which, interestingly, led occult groups like the Theosophists to set up their own parallel structures: journals, conferences, study groups.
Like a shadow academia?
In a way, yes. They were doing their own form of comparative research. And the book notes, it's still an open question how much that perennialist comparative stuff might have influenced mainstream religious studies in the 20th century, even subtly.
So the mainstream field actively worked to exclude certain things. How did they define what was in and what was out? You mentioned pseudoscience.
Yes, that term became important. There was this process, especially early 20th century, of systematically labeling occultist themes or esoteric thoughts as non-scientific or pseudoscientific.
And then excluding them.
And then excluding them from legitimate academic research on religion. The acceptable methods became strictly historical, empirical. Philology, sociology, ethnology, things you could, verify more objectively.
But defining occultism or esotericism must have been part of the battle, right? The definitions themselves were tools.
Absolutely. The authors really stressed this. How you defined occult was part of how you drew the line. And here's a fascinating point. Many occultists and esotericists back then claimed they were being empirical.
They thought they were scientific.
They often claimed to provide results that were replicable, verifiable, fitting the 19th century model of science. They weren't necessarily seeing themselves as purely mystical or irrational.
That complicates the picture. Theosophy seems key here again.
It really was. Theosophy explicitly tried to bridge religion and science. It had this anti-materialist worldview, but also practical aims. And crucially, they claimed superiority over other religions.
Which would have put them in direct competition, in a way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They presented a kind of rational approach to spirituality, claimed empirical methods, and became major players in translating and popularizing non-European religious texts, especially from Asia.
So this whole process of religious studies defining itself, pushing away occultism, it wasn't happening in isolation, was it? Universities were changing too.
Big time. The 19th century saw this massive shift in universities, moving from the old model of just 4 faculties to dozens of new specialized disciplines.
And religious studies pops up in that context.
Yes, after the 1860s, really. But its boundaries were super fluid at first. You had historians, linguists, anthropologists, all studying religion from different angles.
So it took time to become a distinct field with its own journals, departments, PhDs.
A gradual process.
Yeah.
And it had to define itself not just against theology, but also against these other emerging social sciences and against occultism esotericism.
And that pseudoscience label was a useful weapon.
A very powerful one, the authors argue. Just like medicine defined itself against quackery, or astronomy against astrology, or chemistry against alchemy, Religious studies used it against occultism.
What was the long-term consequence of drawing the line that way?
A major one was this sharp separation between normative claims, what's true religion, and empirical research,
Yeah.
what people actually do and believe. And it led eventually to entire fields like the study of esotericism itself being seen as kind of off limits or suspect for a long
Yeah.
time.
Until relatively recently, like the 80s or 90s.
Right, based more on this historical boundary work than necessarily on the merits of the research itself.
And this whole messy, complicated story, it's just left out of the standard histories of religious studies.
Largely, yes. The standard accounts tend to present a much cleaner, more linear progression towards scientific objectivity. The role of occultism as a foil, the exclusion process, it's usually not discussed.
So this book is trying to provide the evidence to rewrite that history.
That seems to be the goal. To offer material for a revised historiography that includes these connections, the breaks, and how the opponents of esotericism actually shape the criteria for studying religion.
It wasn't just institutions and theories, though. What about the people involved? The researchers themselves?
Yes, the personal dimension. The book argues that the boundaries between occultism and science were often very blurry in the actual lives of scholars, especially around 1900.
So individual scientists or humanities scholars might have had personal interests in esoteric ideas.
Much more than we might think, the authors suggest. It's hard to know for sure. Obviously, accessing someone's private beliefs, their forum internum, is tricky.
True.
But the 19th century scientific mindset, which really prized rationality, kind of struggled with the idea that a rational scientist could also hold irrational esoteric beliefs.
Like it had to be one or the other.
Exactly. Whereas, the authors note, perspectives like post-colonial studies have made us more aware that these kinds of intellectual hybridizations are actually pretty normal. People hold complex, sometimes seemingly contradictory ideas all the time.
And do they give examples of scientists with these interests? Because that seems particularly surprising.
They give some really striking ones. Marie Curie,
The physicist,
Yeah.
Nobel Prizes.
that one, reportedly attended spiritualist seances. Albert Einstein.
Okay, now you're just name-dropping legends.
Well, apparently he read Blavatsky, attended lectures by Rudolf Steiner. Georg Cantor, the mathematician who developed set theory.
Also had esoteric interests.
Rosicrucianism, Catholic theories of infinity. Jan Arnold de Schouten, a mathematician in differential geometry, theosophy. Even Thomas Edison was briefly in the Theosophical Society.
Wow. Edison. Okay, so this idea of a neat split between science and, let's say, non-rational beliefs, it just wasn't there on an individual level for many people.
It seems not. The institutional separation between humanities and natural sciences existed, but personally, things were much more mixed.
So bringing it back to the book's overall aims, it's not just listing names and connections. What's the bigger picture they're painting?
Well, materially, yes, it's identifying overlooked people, institutions, ideas, but the deeper questions are about power and knowledge. How did the current way of doing religious studies become dominant?
What logic underlies its history, its self-understanding?
Exactly. Which esoteric traditions got excluded and why? And maybe the most critical question, how much is our current history of religious studies shaped retroactively by a later idea of science that automatically excludes esotericism?
It's asking for a fundamental rethink of the field's origins and assumptions.
Pretty much. A call to understand these historical developments in their own context. Cineata et studio, without anger or bias.
Trying to be objective about the past, even when it involves seemingly non-objective beliefs?
And reflecting on how our own present-day norms shape how we even see that past. The goal isn't to endorse 19th century occultism, but to understand the rationality they saw in connecting it with science back then.
To understand their worldview, even if we don't share it.
Precisely. And maybe by doing that, we can see beyond some of those rigid disciplinary lines today and recognize how interconnected these fields, religious studies and esotericism research, really are.
And the book itself has different chapters exploring specific cases.
Yes, it's a collection. We mentioned Helmut Zander trying to define esotericism for study. Daniel Siranka looks at a scientist with spiritual interests, Nies von Eisenbeck, and asks if religious studies sort of push non-rational religion into the exotic category.
Interesting. What else?
Marco Frenczkowski writes about Britain around 1900, where scientific and occult fields were quite fused. Boaz Huss, whom we mentioned, on early Kabbalah research and its links to perennialism. It's a range of specific studies supporting the main arguments.
Okay, so if we had to boil it down, the big takeaway is what?
I'd say it's that the history of religious studies is just much more complex, much messier, and way more intertwined with these non-mainstream intellectual currents than the standard story admits.
It definitely provides some aha moments. Seeing the gap between the usual narrative of a rational academic field emerging and this evidence of deep connections to occultism and esotericism.
It really does. It complicates the picture significantly.
Which leaves us, and you, the listener, with a thought to chew on. If we acknowledge these hidden roots, how might that change how we understand religious studies today, or how we study spirituality in general?
Yeah, and it makes you wonder, what other academic fields might have similar skeletons in their closets, similar repressed origins?
It definitely highlights those disciplinary boundaries, how they get drawn, maybe how arbitrary they sometimes are.
And the potential value in looking across those boundaries, taking a more interdisciplinary view.